Welcome to Stories Mystics. Hello, dear listener. You've just stepped into a world where stories are not only heard, but deeply felt. Here, every word holds a secret, every tale is a journey, and every character pulls you into their magical universe. Ne lâchez. Don't forget to hit subscribe and become a part of our Stories Mystics family, where every night is a new adventure waiting for you. Now close your eyes, breathe deeply, and allow yourself to drift into this world of cozy mystery and quiet delight. And let's begin tonight's journey.
In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a cryptic note slips under Miss Marple's door, whispering of a vanished poet and a secret hidden in the vicarage's hearth. As shadows stir and old sins resurface, what dark truths will her keen eyes uncover? Why do mysterious lockets keep appearing? And who is desperate to keep the past buried?
Chapter 1. The Whisper in the Vicarage. The morning mist clung to St. Mary Mead like a gossamer shawl, softening the edges of the village's thatched cottages and the steeple of St. Mary's Church. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlor, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she gazed out the window. The roses in her garden bowed under the weight of dew, and the air carried the faint scent of damp earth and honeysuckle. It was a quiet Tuesday, the kind that promised nothing more than a cup of tea and a chat with Mrs. Price at the post office. But as Miss Marple reached for her teacup, a faint rustle at her front door broke the stillness. She rose, her movements spry despite her years, and found a folded note slipped beneath the door. The paper was yellowed, its edges frayed as if torn from an old ledger. In a trembling hand, the words read, "The shadowed guest lingers in the vicarage. Seat the hearth's secret before the fete returns." No signature, no address, only a faint smudge of ink, like a fingerprint pressed in haste. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her mind already turning. The village fete was 3 days away, a tradition as old as the church itself. The vicarage, a rambling stone house beside St. Mary's, had always been its heart. But a shadowed guest— that was a puzzle worth unraveling. She tucked the note into her apron pocket and set out, her sensible shoes tapping along the cobbled path to the vicarage. The vicarage garden was a riot of late summer blooms, tended by the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, who was pruning roses with a distracted air. "Good morning, Jane," she called, her voice warm but strained. "You're early for tea." "I've come on a whim," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "I was thinking of the old fetes, such stories they hold. Do you ever hear tales of the vicarage's past?" Mrs. Clement's pruning shears paused. "Oh, the usual gossip, ghosts in the attic, that sort of thing. Why do you ask?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Just an old woman's curiosity. I heard a whisper about a visitor who vanished during a fete, years ago. A poet, perhaps." Mrs. Clements frowned, her gloved hands tightening on the shears. "A poet? I don't recall. Though old Mrs. Harrow at the almshouse might. She's been here since Queen Victoria's day." Miss Marple nodded, filing the name away. She lingered in the garden, noting the vicarage's ancient chimney, its stones blackened by decades of soot. "The hearth's secret," the note had said. She bid Mrs. Clement goodbye and made her way to the almshouse, a low building at the edge of the village where ivy clung like a possessive lover. Mrs. Harrow, a tiny woman with eyes like polished jet, sat by a window, her hands folded over a tattered shawl. "A poet, you say?" she rasped, her voice like dry leaves. I remember one. Cedric Vaughan, he called himself. Came for the fete in 93, no, 92. Charmed the vicar's sister, Miss Eliza, with his verses. Then he was gone, like mist off the river. Some said he ran off with a gypsy lass, but I never believed it. Miss Marple leaned forward, her knitting needles still in her lap. "And Miss Eliza, what became of her?" Mrs. Harrow's gaze drifted. "She withered, poor thing. Stayed in the vicarage, never married. Folks whispered she'd been jilted, but I saw her eyes. Fear, not heartbreak. She'd mutter about a debt unpaid when she thought no one heard." A debt unpaid. Miss Marple's mind caught the phrase like a burr. She thanked Mrs. Harrow with a jar of her homemade quince jelly and returned to the vicarage, her thoughts circling the hearth. That evening, she joined the Clements for supper, her presence as unassuming as ever. The dining room was cozy, lit by candles that cast flickering shadows on the oak-paneled walls. The vicar, Leonard Clement, a jovial man with a penchant for sermons, was regaling her with plans for the fete. "And we'll have a poetry reading this year," he said, slicing into his roast. "A nod to tradition, eh?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "How fitting. I heard a poet once graced this house. Cedric Vaughan, was it? Left quite a stir, they say." Mrs. Clement's fork clattered against her plate. "Cedric Vaughan? I don't know the name. Leonard, have you heard it?" The vicar blinked, his cheeks flushing. "Can't say I have. Old tales, Jane, you've got a knack for digging them up." Miss Marple sipped her wine, her eyes catching a faint crack in the stonework above the dining-room fireplace. It was barely visible, a hairline fracture running vertically, as if the wall had been tampered with. She changed the subject, complimenting the roast, but her mind was elsewhere. After supper, she lingered by the fireplace, pretending to admire a brass candlestick. Her fingers brushed the cracked stone, and she felt a slight give, a panel perhaps. The next morning, Miss Marple visited the church archives, a dusty room smelling of wax and mildew. The parish records, kept in leather-bound tomes, were a treasure trove of village history. She pored over the entries for 1892, her finger tracing names and dates. There it was, Cedric Vaughan, guest of the vicarage, arrived July 10th, departed July 15th. Departed, or disappeared. Another entry caught her eye. Donation. Anonymous. £50. July 16th, 1892. For church repairs. A substantial sum for the time, and suspiciously timed.
She closed the book, her thoughts racing. A poet vanishes, a donation appears, and Miss Eliza speaks of a debt. Blackmail, perhaps? She needed to see that fireplace again. That afternoon, she returned to the vicarage under the guise of helping with fete decorations. Mrs. Clement was in the garden, leaving Miss Marple alone in the dining room. She knelt by the hearth, her fingers probing the cracked stone. A soft click rewarded her efforts, and a small panel swung inward, revealing a narrow cavity. Inside was a diary, its leather cover cracked with age. The pages were filled with Cedric Vaughan's elegant script, detailing his love for Eliza Clement and his fear of a man he called the warden. "He knows my secret," Vaughan wrote. "He demands payment, or he'll ruin us both. I must vanish, for her sake." The final entry was frantic. "The hearth will keep my truth. Forgive me, Eliza." Miss Marple's heart quickened. The warden could only be one man, Mr. Tobias Green, the churchwarden in 1892, known for his stern demeanor and sudden wealth after the fete. Green was long dead, but his daughter, Miss Agatha Green, still lived in a cottage by the river. Miss Marple resolved to visit her, but first she needed to ensure the diary's safety. She slipped it into her handbag and replaced the panel, her movements swift and silent. Miss Agatha Green's cottage was a quaint affair, its windows framed with lace curtains. The woman herself, nearing 80, had her father's sharp eyes, but a softer manner. Miss Marple sat across from her, sipping tea,
and steering the conversation to the past. "Your father was church warden in '92, wasn't he? A time of great change for the village, I hear." Miss Green's hands trembled slightly, her teacup rattling. "Father was a good man, but strict. He kept secrets, even from me." "Secrets about a poet, perhaps?" Miss Marple's tone was gentle, but her gaze was piercing. "Cedric Vaughan, who vanished during the fête." Miss Green's face paled. "How did you know? Father never spoke of it, but I found papers after he died, letters demanding money, signed by him. He was ashamed, Miss Marple. He'd threatened Vaughan, said he'd expose his debts unless he paid. But Vaughan disappeared, and Father was tormented ever after." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions confirmed. "And the donation to the church, was that his atonement?" Miss Green's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, he gave all he had, hoping to make amends, but it never brought him peace." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Clement, her face flushed from running. "Jane, the vicarage! Someone's broken into the dining room. The fireplace is all torn up." Miss Marple's mind raced. Someone else knew about the hearth. She excused herself and hurried back with Mrs. Clement, her heart pounding. The dining room was in disarray. The hearth's panel smashed open, but nothing was taken because Miss Marple had the diary. She calmed Mrs. Clement, suggesting it was a prank, but her thoughts turned to the fête. Whoever sought the diary might try again. That evening, Miss Marple devised a plan. She invited Miss Green to the vicarage, along with several villagers, under the pretense of a fête planning meeting. The dining room was lit by a roaring fire, casting shadows that danced like specters. Miss Marple held the diary, her voice steady as she recounted Vaughan's story. "Someone among us knows why this diary matters," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "Someone who broke into this hearth, seeking the truth." A gasp came from Mr. Harrow, Mrs. Harrow's grandson, a quiet man who'd inherited the almshouse. I only wanted to protect her," he stammered. "Grandmother told me about Vaughan, said his diary might name my great-uncle as the warden's accomplice. I couldn't let it ruin us." Miss Marple's voice was kind but firm. "The truth doesn't ruin, Mr. Harrow. It heals." She turned to Miss Green, who nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Your father's shame is not yours, Agatha, nor is it yours, Mr. Harrow. Let the past rest." The room was silent, save for the crackling fire. Miss Green took the diary, her hands steady now. "I'll give this to Eliza," she said. "She's still alive in a nursing home in Devon. She deserves to know he loved her." The next day, Miss Marple accompanied Miss Green to Devon. Miss Eliza Clement, frail but lucid, clutched the diary as tears fell. "He didn't abandon me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He protected me." She showed Miss Marple a bundle of Vaughan's unpublished poems hidden in her trunk all these years. "These were his heart. They belong in St. Mary Mead." The fête went ahead as planned, a joyous affair of laughter and music. Miss Marple watched from a bench, her knitting in her lap, as Miss Green presented Vaughan's poems to the village to be kept in the church archives. The air was warm, the roses fragrant, and the shadows of the past seemed to lift, carried away by the breeze. As she walked home, Miss Marple's fingers brushed the note in her pocket. One line lingered in her mind. "The shadowed guest lingers." But another clue nagged at her. A mention in the diary of a locket Vaughan had left for Eliza, hidden in a manor nearby. She smiled faintly. St. Mary Mead was never quite as quiet as it seemed.
Chapter 2. The Locket's Lament. The late summer sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, gilding the rooftops with a honeyed glow. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, her knitting needles pausing as she considered the locket mentioned in Cedric Vaughan's diary. The poet's words had been clear. My heart lies in the locket, hidden where the briars guard the old manor. Briarwood Manor, a crumbling estate on the village's edge, was the only place that fit the description. Its thorny grounds and shuttered windows had long fueled local tales of lost treasures and restless spirits. Miss Marple's curiosity, sharp as ever, urged her to investigate. She donned her best hat, a prim straw affair, and set out for Briarwood Manor, her steps brisk along the winding lane. The manor loomed ahead, its ivy-choked facade like a face half forgotten by time. Lady Haverford, the estate's reclusive owner, had recently opened her gardens for a charity tea to fund the village hospital. It was the perfect excuse for Miss Marple to snoop without raising suspicion. The tea was in full swing when she arrived, with villagers mingling among rose beds and trellises. Lady Haverford, a tall woman with silver hair pinned severely, greeted her with a strained smile. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to come. Do enjoy the scones. They're Mrs. Bantry's recipe." Miss Marple returned the smile, her eyes scanning the crowd. "Such a lovely estate, Lady Haverford. It must hold many stories. I heard a poet once visited here, leaving behind a locket, a romantic tale, don't you think?" Lady Haverford's teacup trembled, her lips tightening. "A locket? Nonsense! This house has no such trinkets." She excused herself abruptly, hurrying toward a group of guests. Miss Marple sipped her tea, noting the lady's unease. As she wandered the garden, she overheard whispers of strange music drifting from the manor's west wing at midnight, haunting notes that kept villagers awake. A young maid, Daisy, clearing plates nearby, caught Miss Marple's eye. Her hands shook as she stacked china, her gaze darting toward the manor's upper windows. "Daisy, dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you look troubled. Is it the music I've heard about? From the west wing?" Daisy's eyes widened. "You've heard it too, miss? It's like a violin, but mournful. Started a month ago, after Lady Haverford's nephew, Mr. Rowland, came to stay. I daren't go near that wing now." Miss Marple patted her hand. "No need to fear. Old houses have their quirks. Tell me, have you ever seen a locket about? A small one, perhaps heart-shaped?" Daisy shook her head, but her expression faltered. "Not a locket, but there's a music box in the drawing room. Lady Haverford keeps it locked, says it's a family heirloom." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. She thanked Daisy and made her way to the manor's entrance, where Lady Haverford was distracted by a guest's spilled tea. Slipping inside, Miss Marple found the drawing room, its air heavy with the scent of polished wood and faded roses. A mahogany music box sat on a sideboard, its lid carved with briars. She tested the latch, locked, as Daisy said. A faint scratch on the wood suggested someone had tried to pry it open. That evening, Miss Marple dined at the village inn, where she struck up a conversation with old Tom, the manor's former gardener, now retired and nursing a pint. His weathered face lit up at her questions about Briarwood's past. "Aye, the manor's got secrets," he said, his voice low. "Back in my father's day there was talk of a curse. Lady Haverford's great-aunt, Miss Beatrice, lost everything, her love, her fortune, after a locket was stolen from her. They say it's why the family's luck turned sour." "A locket?" Miss Marple leaned closer. "Could it be the one Cedric Vaughan wrote of?" Tom scratched his chin. "Might be. Father said Beatrice hid something in that music box before she died. Never opened it, though. Too afraid of the curse."
Miss Marple's mind raced. A locket, a music box, and midnight music, pieces of a puzzle falling into place. She returned to her cottage, her thoughts circling the west wing. The next day, she called on Lady Haverford, offering to help with fête preparations as an excuse to linger. While sorting linens in the manor's parlor, she noticed a portrait of Beatrice Haverford, her stern eyes gazing down. Around her neck hung a heart-shaped locket, identical to Vaughan's prescription. As dusk fell, Miss Marple lingered near the west wing's entrance, a shadowed corridor sealed by a heavy oak door. She heard it then, the faint, mournful strain of violin drifting through the walls. It stopped abruptly, followed by footsteps. She hid behind a curtain as Roland Haverford, a wiry man with a pinched face, emerged, locking the door behind him. His hands clutched a small key, which he slipped into his pocket. Miss Marple waited until he was gone and then examined the door. Its lock was new, unlike the manor's antique fittings. She needed to get inside, but confrontation would be premature. Instead, she enlisted Daisy's help, asking her to keep watch on Roland's movements. The maid, eager to unravel the mystery, agreed. The following night, Miss Marple attended a village concert at the church where Roland was performing a violin solo. His absence gave her a window. Armed with a hairpin and a lifetime of observing human nature, she slipped into the manor with Daisy's help. The west wing's door yielded to her deft touch, revealing a dusty staircase leading to a tower room. The room was a jumble of crates and cobwebs, lit by a single candle. A gramophone set in the corner, its needle poised over a scratched record labeled Nocturne in D minor. She lifted the arm, and the mournful notes filled the air, the same music haunting the village. Beside the gramophone was a notebook, filled with Roland's scrawled plans to sell Briarwood Manor, citing its haunted reputation to drive down the price.
Miss Marple's lips pursed. Roland was staging a ghost to scare his aunt into selling. But where was the locket? She searched the room, her fingers brushing a loose floorboard. Beneath it lay a small velvet pouch containing a silver locket engraved with briars. Inside was a faded note. For Eliza, my heart eternal, C.V. She pocketed the locket just as Daisy's frantic whisper echoed up the stairs. "Miss Marple, he's back!" Footsteps thudded below, and Miss Marple slipped out, locking the door behind her. She and Daisy hid in the parlor as Roland stormed past, muttering about meddling villagers. The next morning, Miss Marple devised a plan to expose Roland without endangering Lady Haverford. She invited the village to a special gathering at the manor, ostensibly to unveil a new fate exhibit. The drawing room was packed, with Lady Haverford at the center, her face pale but composed. Miss Marple stood by the music box, her voice clear and calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, Briarwood Manor holds many treasures, but none so precious as truth. For years a locket has been lost, tied to a poet's love and a family's sorrow." She held up the locket, its silver catching the light. Lady Haverford gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Roland, standing at the back, paled. "Where did you get that?" he demanded, stepping forward. Miss Marple's eyes met his. "From the West Wing, where you've been playing a ghost's tune to frighten your aunt. You wanted Briarwood sold cheap, didn't you? To a buyer you'd already chosen, perhaps a friend who'd split the profits." The room buzzed with shock. Lady Haverford turned to Roland, her voice trembling. "Is this true?" Roland's bravado crumbled. I only wanted what's best for you, Aunt. This place is falling apart. I thought the ghost story would convince you to let it go." Miss Marple shook her head. "You underestimated your aunt's strength and this village's heart. The locket belongs to history, not greed." She handed it to Lady Haverford, who clutched it, tears in her eyes. I remember now. Beatrice spoke of a poet, a love she lost. This was hers, wasn't it? Miss Marple nodded. And Cedric Vaughan's. It's time it found a home. The gathering ended with Lady Haverford announcing the locket would be displayed in the village museum, a symbol of Briarwood's resilience. Roland, chastened, left for London, promising to make amends. Miss Marple watched him go, her thoughts on the locket's journey. As she helped clear the tea trays, a guest, Mr. Quill, an antique dealer from London, approached her. "Remarkable find, Miss Marple," he said, his eyes gleaming. "I saw a locket like that in my shop once. Part of a set, I believe. If you're ever in London, do visit. You might find more to uncover." Miss Marple smiled, her mind already turning to the next mystery. The fate was days away, and St. Mary Mead was quiet once more. But not for long.
Chapter 3. The Antique Shop Conspiracy. The train to London rattled through the countryside, its rhythm a steady counterpoint to Miss Jane Marple's thoughts. She sat by the window, her knitting tucked in her bag, her mind fixed on Mr. Quill's parting words at Briarwood Manor. A locket like Cedric Vaughan's, part of a set, had passed through his antique shop in London. The coincidence was too sharp to ignore, and Miss Marple's instincts whispered of a deeper mystery. St. Mary Mead's secrets had led her here, to the smoky heart of the city, where shadows hid more than ghosts. Quill's Emporium sat on a narrow street in Bloomsbury, its windows crowded with tarnished silver and chipped porcelain. The bell above the door jingled as Miss Marple entered, her sensible shoes silent on the threadbare carpet. The air smelled of old wood and beeswax, and shelves groaned under the weight of curiosities, clocks with frozen hands, jade figurines, and a glass case of jewelry that glinted dully in the gaslight. Mr. Quill, a thin man with a waxed mustache, looked up from his ledger, his smile as polished as his wares. "Miss Marple, what a delight," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "Come to browse, or is there something particular you seek?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "A locket, Mr. Quill, heart-shaped with briar engravings. You mentioned seeing a one like it. I'm curious about its story." Quill's smile faltered, his fingers tapping the counter. "A locket? Oh yes, a passing trinket. Sold months ago, I'm afraid. But do look around. Perhaps something else will catch your fancy." She nodded, her gaze sweeping the shop. A young assistant, Clara, was polishing a brass candelabrum, her movements nervous. Miss Marple wandered to the jewelry case, noting a silver brooch with a briar motif, eerily similar to the locket's design. As she lingered, she overheard two men in a corner, their voices low but urgent. "The broker wants the next shipment by Friday. No delays or we're done for." The broker. The word snagged in Miss Marple's mind like a thorn. She pretended to examine a cracked teapot, her ears straining. The men left abruptly, their coats flapping as the door swung shut. Clara, noticing Miss Marple's interest, approached hesitantly. "Can I help you, ma'am?" Miss Marple smiled warmly. "This brooch is lovely, dear. Does it have a pair, perhaps, a locket?" Her cheeks flushed. I don't know. Mr. Quill handles the special items. He keeps them in the back, locked away." Her voice dropped. "He's been odd lately, ever since that man started visiting. Calls himself Mr. Gray, but I don't trust him." Miss Marple patted her hand. "You're a perceptive girl, Clara. Tell me, does Mr. Quill ever leave the shop at odd hours?" Clara nodded, perhaps glanced at her, then away. "Sometimes late at night. He says it's business, but he comes back looking scared." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind racing. A smuggling ring, perhaps, with lockets and heirlooms as their currency. She needed to see that back room. That evening, she dined at a small cafe nearby,
her thoughts on Mr. Quill's nervous demeanor. She recalled the coded conversation she'd overheard, shipments, the broker, deadlines. It wasn't just antiques moving through this shop. The next day, Miss Marple returned, posing as a customer seeking a gift for her niece. She engaged Quill in chatter about Victorian jewelry, her questions circling the locket. "I'm sure I saw one in your window once, engraved with briars, like the brooch you have." Quill's mustache twitched. "You must be mistaken, Miss Marple. We've no such locket now." He busied himself with a ledger, but his hands shook slightly. Miss Marple noted a curtained doorway behind the counter, likely leading to the back room. She needed a distraction. At her request, Clara fetched a tray of rings from the far side of the shop. As Quill turned to assist another customer, Miss Marple slipped behind the curtain, her heart pounding with the thrill of trespass.
The back room was a cluttered den of crates and ledgers, lit by a flickering lamp. A locked safe stood in the corner, but a desk drawer was ajar, revealing a ledger marked Special Orders. Miss Marple scanned it quickly. Dates, descriptions, and coded names. Briar locket, delivered to Gray, £200. Sapphire ring, to broker, £350. The amounts were staggering, far beyond the value of ordinary antiques. A creak from the floorboard sent her back to the shop, where she resumed browsing just as Quill returned. His eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Miss Marple left with a smile, promising to return. That night, she sat in her modest hotel room, piecing together the puzzle. The broker was the key, a shadowy figure orchestrating a network of stolen heirlooms. But who was he, and why was Quill so afraid? She enlisted Clara's help, meeting her in a quiet park the next morning. The girl was pale, her hands twisting her scarf. "I shouldn't be here, miss. Mr. Quill's been watching me. But I can't stay silent anymore. He's in trouble, deep trouble. Mr. Gray works for the broker, and they're planning something big. I heard them mention a locket, like the one you described." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "You're doing the right thing, Clara. Do you know where they meet?" Clara hesitated. "There's a warehouse in Whitechapel. Mr. Quill goes there tomorrow night. But it's dangerous, miss. They're not good people." Miss Marple squeezed her hand. "Leave it to me, dear. You've been very brave." She spent the day devising a plan, her knitting needles clicking as her mind worked. A direct approach was too risky, but a ruse might draw out the broker. She penned a note to Quill, posing as a wealthy buyer interested in a rare locket, and asked to meet at the warehouse, signing it with a false name. The next evening, Miss Marple arrived at the Whitechapel warehouse, a cavernous building smelling of oil and dust. She wore a plain cloak, her face shadowed by a bonnet. Quill was there, pacing nervously, joined by a tall man with cold eyes, Mr. Gray. "Mrs. Wentworth?" Quill asked, his voice tense. Miss Marple nodded, her accent clipped. "I hear you have a briar locket. I'll pay handsomely, but I must see it first." Gray's eyes narrowed. "Who told you about it?" "A mutual friend," she said smoothly, "in St. Mary Mead." She watched their faces, Quill's panic, Gray's suspicion. The locket was a test, a bait to flush out the broker. Gray stepped closer. "You're no buyer. Who are you?" Before she could answer, a third man emerged from the shadows, his voice smooth as silk. "Enough, Gray. I'll handle this." He was impeccably dressed, his silver hair gleaming under the lamplight. The broker, Miss Marple realized, her pulse quickening. She held her ground. "I know about the lockets, the smuggling. Cedric Vaughan's legacy, stolen and sold. It ends tonight." The broker laughed, cold and sharp. "You're bold, old woman, but you're out of your depth." He nodded to Gray, who produced a knife. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "I've informed the police. They're outside. Harm me, and you'll have nowhere to run." Quill gasped, dropping a crate. "Police! You said this was safe." The broker's smile faded. "She's bluffing." "Am I?"
Miss Marple said, her eyes steady. She'd sent an anonymous tip to Scotland Yard that morning, detailing the warehouse and the smuggling ring. As if on cue, sirens wailed in the distance. Gray swore, bolting for the door. The broker turned to follow, but Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos. "It's over, Lord Ashford." The broker froze, his face ashen. "How did you—" "Your cufflinks, the Ashford crest. A disgraced aristocrat, funding his lifestyle with stolen heirlooms. Cedric Vaughan's locket was just one of many." Police burst in, cuffing Gray and Quill. The broker, Lord Ashford, stood rigid, his empire crumbling. Miss Marple slipped away, her cloak blending into the night. The next day she visited Clara at the shop, now under new management. The police had recovered crates of stolen artifacts, including a second Briar locket. Clara, free from Quill's shadow, hugged Miss Marple. "You saved us, miss." Miss Marple smiled. "You saved yourself, dear." Among the recovered items was a map fragment pointing to a shipwreck off Salt Cliff. As she boarded the train home, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the sea, where the next piece of the puzzle awaited.
Chapter 4. The Wreck of the Silver Tide. The salt-laden breeze of Salt Cliff stung Miss Jane Marple's cheeks as she stepped off the train, her scarf fluttering like a banner. The coastal village sprawled before her, its cliffs jagged against a bruised sky, the sea churning below with secrets of its own. The map fragment from the London warehouse, tucked safely in her handbag, had led her here, to the wreck of the Silver Tide, a ship lost decades ago, rumored to hold a chest of jewels tied to the smuggling ring she'd uncovered. Among those treasures was a locket, perhaps another of Cedric Vaughan's legacy. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp as ever, scanned the horizon, sensing the village held more than just sunken relics. Salt Cliff was a place of weathered charm, its cottages huddled against the wind, their windows glowing like lanterns. Miss Marple checked into the Seagull Inn, a creaking establishment run by Mrs. Tuttle, a stout woman with a laugh like a foghorn. Over a supper of fish pie, Miss Marple steered the conversation to local lore. "I've heard tales of the Silver Tide," she said, her tone light. "A shipwreck with a story, they say." Mrs. Tuttle's eyes gleamed. "Oh, aye, it's a legend here. Sank in '94 off Blackthorn Cliff. They say a ghostly figure guards it, a sailor who betrayed his crew. Folks see him on stormy nights, pacing the cliffs." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. A ghost? How curious. Any talk of what the ship carried? Mrs. Tuttle leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Jewels, some say, a chest of them, stolen from grand houses. But no one's found it. The cliff caves are too dangerous." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning. A chest, a locket, a ghost, pieces of a puzzle she was determined to solve. The next morning she donned her sturdy coat and set out for Blackthorn Cliff, her umbrella doubling as a walking stick. The path was treacherous, winding through gorse and shale, but she pressed on, drawn by the map's cryptic markings, a cross near a cave mouth labeled Tide's Rest. At the cliff's edge she met old Ben, a fisherman mending nets by his boat. His face was etched like driftwood, his eyes wary. "You're the lady asking about the Silver Tide," he said, not looking up. "Best leave it be. That wreck's cursed." Miss Marple smiled, undeterred. "Curses are often just stories, Mr. Ben. I'm more interested in truths. They say a traitor sunk the ship. Do you know his name?"
Ben's hands stilled. Jonas Creed, my great-uncle, he was crew, turned on his mates for a share of the loot. Ship went down in a storm, and he drowned with it, or so they say. Miss Marple noted the flicker in his eyes. And the ghost? Some say he guards a treasure. Ben snorted. Fool's talk. But my sister, Widow Creed, might know more. She's got Jonas's old letters. Widow Creed lived in a cottage perched precariously above the sea, its walls salt-stained and wind-battered. She found her sorting shells by the fire, her fingers nimble despite her years. Jonas was no hero, she said, her voice bitter. His letters spoke of a chest, hidden in a cave before the ship sunk. He meant to fetch it, but the sea took him. Now folks say he haunts the cliffs, keeping others away. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on a faded sketch on the wall, a cave with a jagged entrance, much like the map's marking. This cave, she said, is it near Blackthorn Cliff? Widow Creed nodded reluctantly. Aye, but it's a death trap. Tides flooded without warning. That night Miss Marple lay awake, the inn's shutters rattling in the wind. A storm was brewing, and with it whispers of the ghost. She arose before dawn, determined to see the cave, but as she reached the cliff path, a figure darted across her vision, a cloaked shape, vanishing into the mist. Her heart quickened. No ghost, but someone very much alive. She followed cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the damp earth. The figure led her to the cave mouth, its entrance yawning like a wound in the cliff. Inside, the air was damp, the walls slick with algae. She heard a scrape, a shovel against stone. Creeping forward, she saw a man digging frantically, his lantern casting wild shadows. It was Ben, his face taut with desperation. Miss Marple stepped into the light. "Mr. Ben, I thought you called the treasure a fool's tale." He froze, his shovel clattering. You shouldn't be here. It's not safe." "Nor is it safe to dig up the past alone," she said, her voice calm. "You're after Jonas's chest, aren't you?" Ben's shoulders sagged. "I found his journal last month. He wrote of the chest, jewels, a locket, enough to change my life. I've been searching at night, keeping it secret. The ghost story keeps folks away." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "But someone else knows. I saw them on the cliff." Ben's face paled. "That'd be Ned Tully. He's been snooping, trying to beat me to it." As if summoned, a shadow moved at the cave's entrance. Ned Tully, a burly man with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward, a crowbar in hand. "You're a clever one, old lady, but you're in my way." Miss Marple stood her ground, her umbrella raised like a scepter. "The chest belongs to history, Mr. Tully, and the police are on their way. I sent word this morning." Tully laughed, but his eyes darted to the cave mouth. The distant wail of a siren cut through the wind, and he bolted, slipping on the wet rocks. Ben lunged to stop him, but Miss Marple's voice was sharp. "Let him go, Ben. The truth is worth more than a chase." They returned to the cave, where Ben's digging had uncovered a rusted chest, its lock broken. Inside gleamed a tangle of jewels, emeralds, sapphires, and a silver locket engraved with briars. Miss Marple lifted it, finding a note inside, "For Eliza, my anchor, C.V." Another piece of Vaughan's legacy, smuggled and lost.
Back at the inn, Miss Marple organized a meeting with the village council, presenting the chest and its contents. Widow Creed wept, touching the locket. Jonas meant to give this back, didn't he, to make things right? Miss Marple nodded. He tried in his way. Now you can finish what he started. The jewels were catalogued, their origins traced to families wronged by the smuggling ring. The locket joined its twin in the St. Mary Mead Museum, a testament to love and redemption. As Miss Marple prepared to leave Saltcliffe, Widow Creed handed her a letter from Jonas's journal, mentioning a secret society that funded the smuggling, a group called the Order of the Saffron Veil, with ties to an estate back in St. Mary Mead. The train home rocked gently, and Miss Marple's knitting resumed, her thoughts already on Thornfield Hall. The sea had yielded its secrets, but the village held more, waiting to be unraveled.
Chapter 5. The Order of the Saffron Veil. The autumn air in St. Mary Mead carried a crisp bite, stirring the leaves into restless spirals outside Miss Jane Marple's cottage. She sat by her fire, her knitting needles idle, her mind fixed on the letter from Jonas Creed's journal. It spoke of the Order of the Saffron Veil, a secret society tied to the smuggling ring that had woven its threads through Cedric Vaughan's locket, the London antique shop, and the Silver Tide's sunken chest. The letter hinted at their meeting place, Thornfield Hall, a grand estate on the village's outskirts, its towers cloaked in ivy and mystery. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. A society cloaked in secrecy was a puzzle she couldn't resist. Thornfield Hall loomed like a sentinel, its stone facade softened by mist. Miss Marple had been invited to a garden party to raise funds for the village school, a perfect opportunity to probe the estate's secrets. The lawns were alive with laughter, the clink of teacups, and the scent of lavender. But Miss Marple's attention was on the hall's east tower, where locals whispered of flickering lights at midnight. As she sipped her tea, she noticed Lady Margaret Thorne, the hall's formidable mistress, watching her with a guarded smile. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to join us," Lady Margaret said, her voice smooth as polished oak. "You're quite the village historian, I hear." Miss Marple's smile was disarming. "I do enjoy a good story, Lady Margaret. They say Thornfield has its share. Lights in the tower, perhaps tied to an old society?" Lady Margaret's cup paused mid-air. "Old tales, nothing more. The tower's just storage now." She turned away, her silk shawl fluttering, but Miss Marple caught the tension in her posture. Wandering the garden, Miss Marple struck up a conversation with Thomas, a young footman with a nervous habit of tugging his collar. "The tower must be quite the sight," she said, her tone casual. "Ever been up there?" Thomas glanced at the hall. "Not me, miss. It's locked tight. But I heard noises once, chanting like. Gave me the shivers." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Chanting suggested rituals, and rituals suggested the order. She thanked Thomas and moved toward the hall, where a display of family heirlooms was set up for the party. Among the silver candlesticks and porcelain vases was a tapestry, its threads depicting a veiled figure holding a saffron flower. The symbol matched a sketch in Jonas's letter. She traced the stitching, noting a faint seam along the edge. Something hidden, perhaps? That evening, Miss Marple dined at the vicarage, steering the conversation to Thornfield's history. Mrs. Clement, ever eager to gossip, leaned in. "They say the Thorns were mixed up in something odd years ago, a secret club, all cloaks and whispers. My aunt swore she saw them in the woods, carrying lanterns."
Miss Marple nodded, her mind on the tapestry. "And now, any talk of strange goings-on?" Mrs. Clement hesitated. "Well, there's Lily, the new maid. She vanished last week after working late. Folks say she ran off, but I'm not so sure." Lily's disappearance was a new thread in the tapestry. The next morning, Miss Marple visited the village shop, where Lily's friend Rose was stacking jars. Rose's eyes were red-rimmed, her voice low. "Lily didn't run. She told me she heard voices in the hall, coming from the tower. She was scared, said she'd seen something she shouldn't." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Did she mention a society or a saffron veil? Rose's jaw dropped. "How'd you know?" "She found a scarf, yellow like saffron, in the laundry. Said it was hidden in a guest's coat. She was going to tell Lady Margaret, but then she was gone." Miss Marple patted her arm. "You've done well to tell me, Rose. I'll see to Lily." She left with a plan forming, her thoughts circling the tower. The order was active, and Lily's disappearance was no coincidence. She needed to get inside. Under the guise of delivering a basket of preserves, Miss Marple returned to Thornfield Hall. Lady Margaret was away, leaving the butler, Mr. Grayson, to receive her. He was a tall man with a hawkish face, his eyes cold as slate. "Lady Margaret will appreciate your kindness," he said, his tone clipped, "but the hall is busy today." Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "I'll just leave these in the kitchen then." She lingered, noting Grayson's keys jangling at his belt, one smaller than the rest, likely for the tower. As he turned to answer a knock, she slipped into the great hall, where the tapestry hung. Her fingers found the seam, revealing a hidden pocket. Inside was a list of names, some crossed out, others circled. Grayson, Thorne, broker. The broker, Lord Ashford from London, was dead, but his shadow lingered. A soft cry from the upper floors broke her thoughts. She hid behind a curtain as Grayson stormed past, muttering about meddling maids. Miss Marple followed at a distance, her steps silent on the polished floors. The cry came again, from a servant's passage leading to the tower. She waited until Grayson was gone, then tested the tower door. Locked, but the small key's shape was etched in her mind. That night Miss Marple enlisted Thomas's help. The footman, torn between fear and loyalty to Lily, agreed to distract Grayson during the midnight hour when the chanting was rumored to occur. As the clock struck 12, Miss Marple crept to the tower, her hairpin at ready. The lock yielded, and she climbed the spiral stairs, her breath steady despite the darkness. At the top was a circular room lit by candles arranged in a star pattern. Saffron-colored scarves hung on the walls, and a table held a ledger marked Order of the Saffron Veil. She scanned the pages, records of payments, not for smuggling now, but for extortion. The order had evolved, using secrets to blackmail wealthy villagers. Names she recognized appeared. Lady Margaret, forced to pay to protect her family's past. The vicar, hiding a youthful indiscretion. Lily's name was there, too, marked Trouble. Silenced. A floorboard creaked behind her. Miss Marple turned to find Grayson, his face a mask of fury. "You're a nuisance, old woman," he snarled, blocking the door. "The order doesn't tolerate spies." Miss Marple's voice was calm. "Nor do I tolerate bullies, Mr. Grayson. Where is Lily?" He laughed, cold and sharp. "Safe for now, but you won't be." Before he could move, a shout echoed below. Thomas, calling for help. Miss Marple had told him to alert the village if she didn't return by 1. Grayson hesitated, and Miss Marple seized the moment, grabbing a candle and tossing it into the scarves. The dry fabric caught, smoke curling upward. Grayson lunged to extinguish it, and Miss Marple slipped past, locking the door behind her. She found Thomas in the hall, his face pale. "Lily's in the cellar, miss. I heard Grayson talking to someone." They hurried to the cellar, where Lily was bound but unharmed, hidden behind crates. "He caught me snooping," she whispered, trembling. "He said I'd ruin everything." Miss Marple untied her, her hands steady. "You're safe now, dear, and so is the village." The next morning, Miss Marple organized a meeting at the church with the village council and Lady Margaret in attendance. She presented the ledger, its pages damning. "The Order of the Saffron Veil has preyed on us for too long," she said, her voice clear. "Mr. Grayson led it, using your secrets to line his pockets." Lady Margaret's face crumpled. "I paid to protect my family's name. I didn't know he'd hurt anyone." Grayson, brought in by the police, glared, but said nothing. Lily, clinging to Thomas, spoke up. "He threatened to tell everyone my brother stole when he was a boy. I only wanted to help." Miss Marple nodded. "And you did, Lily. The order is finished." The ledger was turned over to the authorities, and the extorted funds were returned. Lady Margaret, humbled, opened Thornfield's library to the village, a gesture of amends. Lily and Thomas, their bonds strengthened, planned to marry in the spring. As Miss Marple walked home, a journal from the order's records caught her eye, mentioning a child born to a smuggler's widow now living quietly in St. Mary Mead. The final thread of the mystery beckoned, and Miss Marple's knitting resumed, her mind already on the next unraveling.
Chapter 6. The Child of the Shadows. The October light in St. Mary Mead was soft, painting the village in hues of amber and rust. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlor, her knitting needles clicking like a metronome, her thoughts tethered to the journal from Thornfield Hall. Its final entry had unveiled a startling thread: a child born to a smuggler's widow, raised in secrecy in the village, tied to the Order of the Saffron Veil and the Silver Tide's lost treasures. The journal named her Eleanor Gray, the unassuming librarian who tended the village's books with a quiet grace. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. The mystery's final piece lay not in distant seas or shadowed towers, but in the heart of St. Mary Mead. Eleanor's cottage was a modest affair, its garden bursting with late-blooming asters. Miss Marple knocked, a basket of apples in hand, her excuse for the visit. Eleanor answered, her spectacles slipping down her nose, her smile warm but tinged with fatigue. "Miss Marple, what a surprise! Come in, I've just put the kettle on." The parlor was cozy, lined with bookshelves that smelled of ink and leather. On the mantel sat a curious collection, an old coin, a tarnished key, and a silver locket engraved with briars, identical to those Miss Marple had traced from the vicarage to Saltcliffe. "What lovely treasures!" she said, her tone light. "Gifts, perhaps?" Eleanor's fingers brushed the locket, her expression clouding. "They just appear on my doorstep every few months. No note, no explanation. It's unsettling." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind racing. "They remind me of a story I've heard, a smuggler's child, born in secret, whose heritage was tied to a ship's lost jewels. Have you ever heard such a tale?" Eleanor's cup rattled in its saucer. "No, but my mother was a widow from Saltcliffe. She never spoke of my father, only that he was lost at sea. Could it be connected?" Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Perhaps, dear. May I see that locket?" Eleanor handed it over, and Miss Marple opened it, finding a faded inscription: "For my child, safe in shadows, J.C. Jonas Creed, the Silver Tide's traitor, whose journal had led her here. Eleanor was his daughter, hidden to protect her from the smuggling ring's enemies. The conversation was interrupted by a crash outside. Eleanor gasped, rushing to the window. A flower pot lay shattered on the path, a brick beside it. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Someone was watching, and they weren't pleased. She calmed Eleanor, suggesting they call the constable, but her thoughts were on the gift's sender and their motive. The next day, Miss Marple visited the library, where Eleanor was cataloging books with a distracted air. The village was abuzz with preparations for the harvest festival, but Miss Marple's focus was on Eleanor's past. She pored through old records in the library's archive, finding a birth certificate. Eleanor Creed, born 1895, mother Mary Creed, father unknown. A newspaper clipping mentioned Mary's move to St. Mary Mead after the silver tide sunk, her silence on her husband's fate fueling gossip. At the village shop, Mrs. Price chatted with Mrs. Price, whose memory for scandal was unmatched. Mary Creed was a mystery, Mrs. Price said, slicing cheese. Came here with a baby and no husband. Some said she was hiding from trouble. Her cousin, Harold Creed, still lives out by the mill. He might know more. Harold Creed was a gruff man, his face lined from years of toiling at the mill. Miss Marple found him repairing a sluice gate, his hands stained from river mud. "I'm tracing an old story," she said, her voice gentle, "about Mary Creed and her child. Were they running from something?" Harold's eyes narrowed. Mary was scared, that's all I'll say. Jonas, her husband, crossed dangerous folk. After he drowned, she came here to keep Eleanor safe. I swore to protect them, but I've no patience for old ghosts. Miss Marple noted his clenched fists. And these gifts Eleanor receives, coins, a locket. Someone's stirring the past. Harold's face darkened. I've seen them. Thought it was a prank. If someone's after her, they'll answer to me. That night, Miss Marple sat by her fire, piecing together the clues. The gifts were no prank. They were a message, perhaps from someone tied to the Order or the Silver Tide. But why now? And why the brick through Eleanor's pot? She resolved to watch the cottage, suspecting the sender might return. Under cover of dusk, she positioned herself in a neighbor's garden, her dark shawl blending with the shadows. Hours passed, the village silent save for the hoot of an owl. Then a figure approached Eleanor's gate, cloaked and hooded, placing a small parcel on the step. Miss Marple's pulse quickened, but before she could move, a second figure emerged. A man, his face obscured, wielding a stick. He lunged at the cloaked figure, who fled into the night. Miss Marple hurried to the parcel, finding a pearl brooch with a note. Forgive the past. She recognized the handwriting from Jonas's journal. The sender was someone connected to the Silver Tide, seeking atonement. But the attacker, likely Harold, protecting his cousin's secret, meant to stop them. The next morning, Miss Marple confronted Harold at the mill. You attacked someone last night, she said, her voice firm but kind. They're trying to make amends, not harm Eleanor. Harold's shoulders slumped. I thought they were threatening her. After Mary died, I found Jonas's papers, said Eleanor might inherit a fortune, but it'd bring trouble. The Order, the smugglers, they'd never let her have it. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. A fortune? From the Silver Tide? Harold nodded. Jonas hid a share of the jewels, meant for his child. I've kept it secret, but someone's digging it up. Miss Marple's plan took shape. She needed to draw out the sender and protect Eleanor. She organized a tea at her cottage, inviting Eleanor, Harold, and key villagers, including Mr. Baxter, a retired solicitor who'd known Mary Creed. As they gathered, she placed the brooch, locket, and coin on the table. These are gifts from someone seeking forgiveness. They belong to Eleanor's past, tied to her father, Jonas Creed. Eleanor gasped, her hand trembling. My father?
But Mother said he was a sailor, nothing more." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "He was, but also a man caught in a web of greed. He left you a legacy, hidden to keep you safe." Before she could continue, the door burst open. A man stood there, his face weathered, his eyes haunted. Samuel Tuttle, Mrs. Tuttle's brother from Saltcliffe, who'd once crewed on the Silver Tide. "I sent the gifts," he said, his voice breaking. "I was Jonas's mate. I helped him hide the jewels, but I couldn't save him. I've been leaving them for Eleanor, to right my wrong." Harold lunged, his fists raised. "You brought them danger to her." "Enough, Harold," Miss Marple stepped between them. "Samuel's not the threat. Someone else is." She turned to the room, her gaze piercing. Someone who threw a brick fearing Eleanor's claim. A gasp came from Mr. Baxter, his face pale. "It was me," he whispered. "I handled Mary's affairs. When I saw the gifts, I feared the smugglers' heirs would come for her, ruin her life or worse." Miss Marple's voice softened. "You meant to protect her, but secrets only harm. Eleanor deserves the truth." Samuel knelt before Eleanor. "The jewels are in a bank vault, under Jonas's name. They're yours, lass, to do with as you please." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I don't want wealth. I want my mother's peace." The room was silent, the weight of the past settling like dust. Miss Marple arranged for the jewels to be appraised, their origins traced to return what was stolen. Eleanor chose to donate the fortune to the library, transforming it into a haven of knowledge for the village. At the Harvest Festival, she stood proudly as the new wing was unveiled, her father's name honored, not cursed. Miss Marple hosted a final tea, with Eleanor, Samuel, and Harold among the guests. Laughter filled her parlor, the locket gleaming on the mantel, a symbol of closure. As the sun set, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting resumed. The order was dismantled, the Silver Tide secrets laid bare, and Eleanor's shadow lifted. St. Mary Mead was quiet once more, its stories told. She smiled, her needles clicking, content that no mysteries lingered. For now.